And so when we learn to relate in this compassionate way, we can help each other to heal the patterns that have been established from the violence of our background. We can help each other to emerge out of that, to help each other to heal. To me, that is one of the most beautiful things. I've seen a lot of beautiful things, and as NVC has trickled into people's lives. But for me, that's one of the most beautiful.
Welcome to another episode of the Preparing for Pregnancy After Loss podcast. And I have the pleasure of sitting with Steve Torma, who is my teacher of compassionate communication. And I was lucky to go through that course and learn as much as I did. And probably in the very first session, had this knowing that I would invite you to be a guest on the podcast. So grateful that you're here. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you, Natalie. Love being here with you.
Yeah, thank you. So I am going to read your bio so people have a sense of who you are. And then we're going to talk about compassionate communication and how that can help to bring more balance and healing to relationships. Okay.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So Steve, him, was born and raised on a family farm in Ashtabula, Ohio, and is a 25-year member of Earth Haven Eco-Village. His ancestors are Hungarian and French-Canadian. Steve co-founded an intentional community in Ohio in 1980, where he lived until joining Earth Haven Eco-Village in 1996. At Earth Haven, he co-founded a thriving neighborhood, was president for 3 years, and has taught nonviolent communication for 12 years. In addition to his passion for community, Steve co-managed a natural foods co-op for 10 years, ran his own traveling bookstore business for over 20 years, and now teaches nonviolent communication and other relationship and community building skills through the Real Center, which he co-founded in 2009. As a lifelong peace, justice, and ecology educator and activist with over 40 years of community living, Steve has sought to integrate personal and social transformation in his own life, in the communities where he lives, and in the larger society. His passion for integral living and thinking has led him to study and experiment with a wide range of spiritualities, psychological systems, and social theories as they relate to creating a more just and sustainable world. Steve has taught nonviolent communication for a variety of intentional communities, organizations, and regional gatherings, including CELO Community, the Mountain Retreat Center, Firefly Gathering, Southeast Permaculture Gathering, Organic Grower School, Connection Campout, Love Evolution Gathering, Compassion Camp, and many others. Wow, 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 wow. What a bio. So grateful to be sitting with you and chatting with you. Yeah, thank you again for joining us, Steve.
I feel so happy and warm-hearted just knowing that you want to hear what I have to say.
Yeah, I consider myself to be a lifelong learner. So I'm usually looking into other things that I can learn just to elevate my own consciousness. And from going through your course, there were so many connections that were made from other things that I've learned. And it feels like one of the single most important courses that I've taken. And so, yeah, I'm holding just a lot of gratitude that, that opportunity presented itself. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And of course, which has led to my excitement for sharing it with others, because I think that when we can learn these tools, we can lead healthier lives and have healthier relationships.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll start with this first question, Steve, which is, what is nonviolent communication?
Yeah, nonviolent communication, or also called compassionate communication, which you referred to it earlier, is a it's a combination of things. One is it's a model of communication that was developed by a man named Marshall Rosenberg, who traveled around the country and around the world for about 50 years, developing this system and sharing it with people and honing it as he was going around the world. Yeah, he started in the 60s when, of course, there was a lot of social justice stuff going on, peace movement, racial integration, women's movement, and so forth. And so he was helping people to communicate with each other and work with each other. And the main term that was new in the culture at that time for what he was doing was nonviolence. Martin Luther King, especially, making this a term that was starting to be common in the culture. So it was a name that was kind of given to it by what he was doing. He was just traveling around helping people to communicate and make peace in the world. Other people started calling it, nonviolent communication, and it kind of stuck. And I had the opportunity to ask him once, Marshall, if you could start over, knowing that you don't really like the term nonviolent communication because it says what it's not and doesn't say what it is. I said, what would you call it? Your work, your life work. And he said, compassionate connection. So that's what NVC is about. It's about compassionate connection with ourselves and each other, and how we interact as individuals and communities in the world, not only the direct action that we have with each other, but also the systems that we create, whether these systems, to what degree these systems are contributing to violence and oppression, or contributing to compassion, harmony, justice, and so forth. So it's both a practical model of communication, as well as, you might call it, a consciousness, or even a spirituality, or an intention. So these are the two pieces. And one of the things that Marshall was most adamant about is that nonviolent communication not be reduced to just a model of communication. That is only a small part of what it's about. It's mostly about what it's serving. It is serving the consciousness, the spirituality of compassion, or more simply put, how to live the golden rule of love thy neighbor as thyself, right? So that's kind of at the core of all world religions, is this universal concept. Human beings have always noticed that when we can live in this way, caring about my needs and your needs equally, moment by moment, things go better. We're happier. Our communities and families are thriving better, and so forth.
Yeah.
So NVC is a combination of both of those things, of both model of communication and the consciousness or the spirituality that it serves.
Yeah. Beautiful. So a question that's come into mind is, whenever I share the term nonviolent communication with other people, the response is usually like, oh, I'm not violent. I'm not being violent. I'm just speaking my mind, or saying how I feel, or being direct. So I don't think people are in tune with how language or communication can be violent. So I'd love for you to share more about that as well.
Sure. I think there's lots of different ways to define what violence is, but in NVC, Marshall's definition was pretty simple. Violence is trying to make somebody do something, trying to force somebody to do something. And it is so common in our culture that it's not even recognized most of the time as violence. Things have to get pretty intense, screaming at each other or hitting each other, or, when the systems of racial and gender oppression, it has to get pretty intense before people even notice it as violence. But you start with the assumption that trying to force somebody to do something, then it's pretty clear that we've all been raised to one degree or another with this way of thinking and communicating and acting that one could define as violence.
Wow, thank you. And I'm really curious, what drew you to nonviolent communication?
Yeah, it was kind of a multiple stages of it. I accidentally ran into it when I was in my 20s, working at a holistic health center in Boston, and they had an afternoon in-service for the staff that I attended, and it was not Marshall who came, but somebody who knew basic NVC, and we taught it for an afternoon introduction to NVC. And so in the simplicity of how I understood things at that point in my life, I thought, oh, okay, now I understand what nonviolent communication is. I've got this. Great. Okay. Got it. And but fast forward about 25 years, and now I'm living at Earth Haven Eco Village, and there was a lot of conflict going on in my life. My own closest personal partner relationship. There was a lot of pain and violence going on in my neighborhood and in all of Earth Haven. And again, maybe some of the people who were there at that time wouldn't have defined it as violence, but I certainly did, and I certainly experienced it that way. And others who I was closer to at the time, we were feeling, kind of desperate about, gosh, this is taking such a toll on us, emotionally, physically, our relationships, the level of conflict and violence that we're having here. And so somebody remembered that there was someone in Asheville who was teaching NVC classes. And so our neighborhood hired him to come and do a class for just our neighborhood, an 8-week class. And this time around, I had a much deeper capacity to understand what NVC was about at the deeper levels. And it immediately landed as a very powerful tool that I could see help me get out of my own violent speaking, thinking tendencies, and could see that was be very helpful to our neighborhood and all of Earth Haven.
Yeah.
And so immediately, I and a few other folks kind of threw ourselves into it to learn and to teach, share with others, and started to immediately notice the benefit. And I was convinced at that point. The other thing was that in my adult life, kind of like you were saying, being a lifelong learner, I had come across a lot of other schools of thought and systems and so forth. And there were key ideas out of those that I was taking and kind of creating my own kind of value system and worldview and all of that. And as I got deeper into NVC, I could see it kind of like a jigsaw puzzle fitting with all of these other pieces to create both an internal and to help create an external world that would be more in alignment with the dreams and visions that I had for myself and for Earth Haven.
Yeah, beautiful. What are some shifts that you typically see after people have learned and really integrated the principles of NVC, compassionate communication, compassionate connection?
Yeah. I think the first thing or one of the first things that becomes really noticeable is how much more inner peace we have. That most of us grew up in environments where we were judged, criticized, blamed, told that we're, this or that or the other thing, a lot of negativity. And those external voices become our internal voices.
Mm.
So that as we, grow up and we leave our families of origin and so forth, or the subcultures that we grew up in or whatever, we are now carrying that negative self-talk with us.
Mm-hmm.
And it creates a lot of stress.
Yeah.
The constant chatter in my mind of, gosh, am I neurotic? Am I normal? Am I really too fat? Am I stupid? Am I too much? Or am I really too needy? And just the ongoing, chatter of judgment and criticism and self-blame and all that kind of stuff, which is, it's a type of internalized oppression. You're probably familiar with that term. It's like we surrounded, or we're impacted by the violence around us, and then we internalize it, and it becomes our own inner voices. And so there's a sense of peacefulness, or more ease, and to be able to just be with myself more easily, more calmly, because I'm not constantly fighting with these voices in my head. So I would say that's probably one of the first main ones. The other thing that immediately, or that people sometimes immediately, but eventually experience pretty profoundly, is a dramatic drop in the violence that we have with each other. And again, finding violence the way that I did earlier, not just physical violence or whatever, screaming swear words at each other. And there's an opening of the heart, which sounds like a kind of a fancy new age word, but it just means the ability to feel my warm feelings of connection with other people. And that flow of that, it's just a natural flow of being human with each other, can get very diminished by thinking and speaking in these judgmental, blaming kinds of ways. So this flow can get very diminished, or even to the point where people want to end relationships because it's just too painful. So we start noticing an ease with each other, and we start noticing more satisfaction and pleasure of being with each other. I would say the third thing that comes is that dramatic increase in the ability to work through conflict. And so, and again, conflict is not a bad thing. We're not in any way saying we're trying to get rid of conflict. Conflict is a part of being human. It's one way I like to think about it is it's just information that is present in the field between you and I. And so when we're in the mode of trying to make you believe what I believe, or make you do what I want you to do, and you're trying to make me believe what you believe and make me do what you want to do, and we have conflict, it's very painful, and it usually does not end well. And so we learn to let up on this trying to make each other do things, and we have more of a trust that if we just can be present with each other and kind of relax into this, what is present with us in terms of our feelings and our needs, we can trust that will lead us to a good place. So that's the third thing. And there's others, but I would say those are the three most important ones.
I'm loving what you brought up about relationships, the difference it makes in relationships to have NVC as a tool versus not having it as a tool. And I imagine that when the negative self-talk is internalized but isn't expressed in any way, then it might feel like, even in a partnership or a relationship, that the individuals are living in different realities or different worlds or different perceptions of what's happening. One of the things that came out of our previous conversation was Dominator Culture, and how that shows up in the majority of relationships, because that's just what we're taught. So I'd love for you to share more about that the way most of our relationships operate, and
Mm-hmm.
how differently it could operate.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a very important topic. And whenever I begin this topic, I like to give acknowledgement to a woman named Rian Eisler,
Mm.
and a very seminal book that she wrote in the 90s called The Chalice and the Blade. And she's
The
still
Chalice
at
and
it
the Blade.
in her 90s. I think she's in the 90s now.
Mm-hmm.
And she's still at it, helping people to understand.
Mm-hmm.
The way that she articulates it
Mm-hmm.
is that there are these two very different forms of culture, or ways that humans organize themselves to try to get their needs met.
Mm-hmm.
And the dominant one, or the most common one, that on this planet, the last 5,000 years, 8,000 years or so, has
Mm-hmm.
been what is often called a dominator culture.
Mm-hmm.
Which to put it in NVC language, it's the pattern of trying to get your needs met by making people do things.
Mm.
And so it has a subtle form, and it has a very gross, exaggerated form.
Yeah.
War, slavery, those kind of
Mm-hmm.
brutal things that have been happening on this planet.
Mm-hmm.
The other polarity that she talks about, which has been more of a minor experience over the last some number of thousands of years, has been what she calls partnership cultures.
Mm.
And these are cultures of general equality between men and women.
Mm-hmm.
People not owning each other, or even believing that that's something that would even be considered.
Mm-hmm.
Getting needs met through collaboration and mutual care and respect.
Mm-hmm.
And that has always existed on this planet,
Mm-hmm.
but it's been under a lot of pressure, the last 5,000 years or so, as these dominator cultures, or sometimes they're called war cultures, have moved around the planet. And I'm not just talking about Western culture, but we certainly, have had a pretty vicious form of it, but been a pretty universal thing on the planet. So what we have inherited in Western culture, American society, is a way of thinking, a way of seeing reality, of thinking about reality, thinking about human beings. What is our nature? How do we want to get our needs met? And all of that has been shaped by this very violent dominator culture. So it starts with certain assumptions and ends up with certain behaviors. And we can go into that more if we want. But the partnership culture, starts with very different assumptions. And so therefore ends up with very different behaviors. And NVC comes out of the partnership culture tradition, which is rooted in the belief that the most natural thing for human beings to do is to want to, and this is Marshall's language now, to contribute to life. That we're like human beings are like everything else in nature. We came out of the earth, and the same dynamics that created the earth and created this amazing explosion of life and diversity and interdependence and beauty and bounty, like that amazing, whatever you want to call that, you can call it God, you can call it Gaia, you can call it the Great Spirit, you can call whatever you call that energy, that divine energy, is what created us. And we're just like that, in the sense of nature wants us to thrive and wants us to contribute, to give and receive in a way that helps everything to thrive. Now, we are different, certainly, in some ways from other animals and creatures and so forth, in terms of things like self-reflexive consciousness and all that. So I'm not saying that we are identical, but the belief is that we are like everything else in nature, that our basic nature is we are designed, or we are programmed, we are at the deepest level, what we want is to contribute to life. The life inside of me, the life inside of you, the life inside of everyone else. That is a fundamental, very fundamental and very important assumption about NV, or that NVC operates on. And it informs, and it's the foundation for all the other practices that we then develop out of that.
Thank you. Yeah. So something that's coming to mind is what you shared about the dominator culture, and it's, you know, trying to force someone to have your needs met. And I'm thinking of the subtle ways that that might show up. It, you know, emotional manipulation, I think, is probably one of the more prominent ones. You know, so the sentence, for example, if you loved me, you would do that. If you cared about me, you would do that. So playing upon guilt or other emotions, and even how you know, like what power struggles might be in a relationship. So maybe the higher earner has more power in the relationship and is able to, or has more weight in terms of decisions that are made in the relationship. So just these subtle ways that, you know, how we relate to each other might show up, and how honoring each other and meeting each other's needs, that comes through practicing nonviolent communication.
Yeah. I think to address that, I want to start with this fundamental difference of the understanding of the human.
Yeah.
That is present here for those of us who are working with this consciousness shift. Okay. So I was raised Catholic. My family was very Catholic. We went to a Catholic school, and so we had the dogma, and all of that was poured into us at a very deep level. And so everything I'm about to say is stuff that I personally grew up with. So, and I want to be clear, I am not bad-mouthing Catholicism or Christianity or Jesus. I actually have been immensely enriched by aspects of Christianity and Catholicism. However, there are parts of it, in my opinion, that are very much dominator culture oriented. I think Jesus himself was, and Rian Eisler talks about this, was a very much a partnership person. He was a teacher of partnership culture, of compassion and justice and so forth. Okay. So what we were told over and over and over again is that human beings are born sinful. Right? We're born with original sin. And that every moment of our life, there's this struggle between my sinful nature and what I know is good.
Yeah.
And that the forces, often we would use the term devil, that the devil is trying to get my soul and make me do bad things. And so my dad would literally say this to me. I loved my dad, and I understood why he said this, although I don't agree with it now. But he would tell me this because he wanted me to be a good person. And so then he would say this before he would then spank me or hit me or somehow punish me. He wanted me to know that I'm going to hit you now. I'm going to spank you now. I'm going to punish you now. But it's because I want you to be a good kid. I want you to grow up to be a good person.
Yeah.
So this is, and this is how we've operated in our culture for the most part for hundreds of years, if not thousands. And so the fundamental belief is that people are sinful, or if you want to use more secular language, human beings are selfish. Our fundamental nature is to be selfish. So how do you make people be good? That's the question in dominator culture or in dominator type religions. Not all religions are dominator religions, right? That's the question. How do you make people be good? And so those of us today now who don't identify as Christian, but we still operate this way. The pattern is somebody's doing something, doesn't meet my needs, I am now going to label them. You are a sinner. Well, I'm not going to use the word sinner because I don't use religious language. I'm going to use secular language. You are selfish.
Mm-hmm.
You are a narcissist. You are a bully. Whatever. I'm going to put some kind of label on you. And now you're supposed to change.
Mm.
But if you don't change, now I am justified in using more violence. I'm justified now to try to make you change. Right? So how might I do that? Well, I might do it physically, or I might do it through emotional pain by calling you a name, like, Natalie, what kind of partner are you?
Mm.
You are so selfish, right? So now that's supposed to make you change. That's supposed to make you be good. And it's obviously a disaster. It's a disaster. But we just don't know better. And this is one of the greatest gifts that Marshall gave me, and I think many people, is he kind of identified the code of how the dominator mind works. Our needs are not getting met. We would like them to get met. We label you. Now you're supposed to change. And if you don't change, now I'm justified in increasing the violence towards you. Right? So that's a disaster. So much of the violence that goes on between people, between partners, is coming out of that dynamic.
Yeah.
I'm in pain because my needs are not being met. And the pain is growing, and I'm trying to express to you how what I'm feeling and what I'm needing, but I don't have a language of feelings and needs. What I've been taught is, instead of telling you what's going on for me, I tell you what's wrong with you. So instead of saying, Natalie, I'm really hurting right now, I'm like really lonely, and I'm like really needing comfort and support. Instead of saying that, which naturally, I'm not saying it will in every situation, but in general, between human beings, that evokes care.
Yeah.
When I just reveal what's going on inside of me. And so instead of doing that, I say something like, why don't you ever care about me? You're so selfish. Right? And then that's going to create pain and separation.
Yeah.
Or if you do what I want you to do, and you're doing it because you feel guilty, or I've shamed you into doing it, then you may do what I want, but it will have an erosive, damaging effect on our relationship.
Yeah. Wow.
So that's the fundamental dynamics that Marshall was able to identify, that I am infinitely grateful for understanding how we've been conditioned to behave like that, and why our relationships are so painful so often. I don't know if I addressed your question the way that you were hoping that I would, and I'm happy to take a different approach at it. But to me, that piece is enormously important to understand those dynamics.
Yeah, you did. And that's so helpful. And a part of what I am hearing, or what's coming up for me, is the importance of authenticity, honesty, and also vulnerability in the relationship, for someone to be able to name, this is what's going on for me, instead of trying to place blame on someone else, or criticism. And so with that, I'd love to talk about the differences in how men versus women might operate in a relationship based on what we're taught culturally. Because I know that vulnerability is harder for men, because they're not taught to be vulnerable. So I'd love for you to share more about that.
Yeah, thanks for asking. This is a very tender subject for me, because, growing up when I did, and in my family and my culture and all that, by the time I was 12 years old, I was so armored up, I'm not going to feel, especially not going to cry, that I basically only cried like 5 times in the next 18 years. It wasn't until my mother died when I was 30 that I was able to have some genuine tears. And of those 5 times in those 18 years, 3 of them were in therapy. So in 18 years, there was only 2 natural life experiences that could push through the armoring of I'm going to be a man. And so that, again, this varies from person to person and subculture to subculture. And I'm grateful that in the last 50 years, that has changed a lot for men in our culture, but it's still very prominent. That to be accepted, to be loved, to belong, to matter, I have this usually unconscious, the assumption that I need to be a certain way, and that certain way involves a lot of repression of my feelings. And again, it's usually not conscious, but it's and to understand that dynamic, it's really important to understand from an evolutionary perspective, evolutionary psychology perspective, that little human beings know instinctively that their survival depends upon being cared for by the adults in their lives. And so without having to be told, it's deep in our conditioning that I will adjust whatever I'm doing, however I'm showing up in the world. I will change that if the people around me insist that I be a certain way in order to be cared for, in order to not be yelled at, to not be hit, to not be made fun of. Right? If I have to be a certain way in order to have acceptance, because in the primate mind, acceptance, belonging equals life. And rejection, to be criticized and be told that you're, bad and wrong and all that, goes in as life-threatening, especially to the young primate, but to all primates, because belonging to the pack is how we survived. So it is such a deep, many people, like, I know I remember going through this, and I hear it from people all the time, like, God, what is wrong with me that I do this stuff? These things that I do, I don't talk about my feelings, or I yell at someone when I want something and it makes everything worse, or I lie, or I, whatever the things are that we do that we can recognize are unhealthy. That I have virtually all of them. I've never seen an example yet of something that didn't come out of this was a response to the violence that I grew up with. And the main source of that is I wanted to belong. I wanted to matter. I wanted to be accepted to the people around me. And this was the conditions for being accepted. And so women have their version of that, right? Often, and again, all of this is changing. So I know that I'm going to speak in stereotypes, but women in general have been taught to be submissive to men. Men have been taught to not feel. Men have been taught to be able to go to war, to be killed and kill others for the king or for the empire or for the corporation. So we have these different versions of how we're conditioned by our culture that comes out of this deep desire to want to belong, to want to matter, to want to be accepted. So the differences between men and women, certainly some of it we're discovering is in the brain. There's some very biological differences, but my limited understanding of this is that it's mostly cultural, and that we're taught these various ways, and they are all part of being raised in an authoritarian system where we're basically taught obedience to authority is the highest virtue. Right? In the old days, it was obedience to the king, or obedience to the lord of the land that I lived on. Right? And then it, and it has evolved. In our time, it's obedience to a lot of it is obedience to images on television. Like,
Mhm.
obedience to, this is how a woman looks, this is how a man looks, this is how
Mhm.
these are the clothes you're supposed to wear, this is how much money you're supposed to have, this is all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so the 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 basic pattern, whether it's men or women, is both operating or comes from this
Mhm.
dominator system.
Mhm.
Now, in saying that, I do not want to in any way diminish the fact that the enormous amount of violence, physical and emotional, that has been done to women by men over the centuries, over the millennia. I'm not trying to say that they've been had equal footing in this power over thing, not at all.
Mhm.
Right? But if we want to change that, not if, since we want to change this,
Mhm.
in order to be effective change agents, we have to understand where this violence comes from
Mhm.
and how to transform it at a deep level instead of just a superficial level.
Yeah.
So the violence, men need to understand the violence that has been done to them in order to heal from that violence
Mhm.
and to stop their violence against women and children and nature and so forth. So
Mhm.
and so I love Rian Eisler and Marshall and others who have helped us to understand. I want to give notice to a woman named Mickey Cashton as well,
Mhm.
who is also, she's an NVC teacher and who has also done fabulous work on helping us to understand what are the roots of this violence and then how do we address the roots of this violence.
Mhm. Mm. Thank you for that. Can you share more about some imbalances that might show up in relationships as a result of, violence inflicted, whether it's during childhood or whenever, and it's still showing up in adulthood? I'd love for people to be able to recognize it if it's happening so that they don't go, oh, we're not that bad or this isn't happening. So some examples would be really helpful.
Sure. Yeah, the first thing to kind of be monitoring ourselves as we're going through our day and our relationships is,
Mhm.
am I trying to make this person do something?
Mm.
Right now, while that's how we define violence, trying to make people do something, I want to be very clear as well. Within the NVC system of thought, there is a thing called protective use of force.
Mm.
Okay, so force can be used within the NVC system in what we would consider a life-serving way.
Mhm.
The most simple example that is often used is if your child's going toward the street and you grab them and pull them back from the street. You have used
Mhm.
physical force to make them do what you want to do, but it was for the purpose of life, serving life, and they're
Mhm.
protecting.
Mhm.
Another example is if a man is being physically violent to a woman.
Mm.
We may restrain, somebody may restrain him because he's not able to restrain himself.
Mhm.
Something has happened inside of him that he's lost his humanity. He's lost touch with his compassionate nature. And
Mm.
so he needs to be restrained. But the restraint is not punishment. The intention is not to punish. The
Mhm.
intention is to help him reclaim his humanness,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
So if you're a man, obviously it's not always men, but mostly it's been men. If you're a man who is physically violent, it's pretty likely that you have a lot of healing to do yourself
Yeah.
around the violence that has been done to you.
Mhm.
And in my family, there's a beautiful story. I get teary just about every time I think about it.
Mm.
My father told me a number of times throughout his life, he told this story,
Mm.
but especially at the end of his life. I took
Mm.
care of him at the end of his life when he was dying, so we had a lot of chance to talk.
Mm.
And he said when he was a kid, like a teenager age, he witnessed his dad hit his mom.
Mm.
And it was so painful for him to see that he vowed that he would never do that.
Mm.
And that if he ever hit his wife, when he got married, if he ever hit his wife, he said he prayed that God would cut his arm off.
Mm.
Right? And my dad was a very religious man. That was a serious prayer.
Mm-hmm.
That was not just, symbolic prayer.
Mm-hmm.
So while that's a pretty extreme situation, it's the kind of intention and it's the kind of commitment that we need. And I'm going to talk specifically about men right now. It's the kind of intention, it's the kind of commitment that we need to not pass on the violence
Mm-hmm.
to the women in our lives. And I'm glad to say that in our family and my siblings, there's 11 of us,
Mm-hmm.
that, to my knowledge, no man has ever hit a woman in my generation, in our family. So my dad broke that cycle of violence.
Mm-hmm.
However, he still thought that it was a good idea to hit children, to use corporal punishment, as the euphemism says.
Mm-hmm.
And so he wasn't able to break that cycle of violence.
Mm-hmm.
And he hit all of us. But all of us, his children, eventually eliminated physical violence as a way of raising children.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the kind of intention and realization and commitment that it takes to be able to break these cycles of violence.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's violence that is more emotional violence.
Mm-hmm.
And that is often more difficult to even notice that we're doing. Physical violence, fortunately, we've grown a lot. We've evolved a lot in our culture to being less accepting of physical violence,
Mm-hmm.
have more in place to prevent it and more in place to help heal when it does happen.
Mm-hmm.
But it obviously still happens a lot.
Yeah.
And so we're slowly now becoming more aware of what we mean by emotional violence. And that gets to be a little bit more complex, but I really want to address what NVC has to say about that as well. One of the things that Marshall and others too, but would speak about as a foundational understanding for how human beings work
Mm-hmm.
is that everything we ever do is an attempt to meet a need.
Mm.
Like we're like everything else in nature. Everything that we're doing, we're trying to thrive. We're trying to be the best. I'm trying to be the best Steve that I can be. And you're trying to be the best Natalie you can be.
Mm-hmm.
Every human being's trying to be the best that they can be. However, based on our cultural conditioning, what we've learned growing up and all of that,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes we try to get our needs met through violence.
Mm.
But it does not change the fact that what I'm trying to do is to get my needs met.
Mm.
And so, if to the degree that we understand this, it can help a person break their own cycles of violence by asking myself, what is it I need right here? So if you and I are partners and we're having a conflict, if I'm aware that what I want is to be understood, and I'm wanting to be heard and to be understood, if I'm really in touch with that as my need, then I'm much less likely to say the things that are going to push you away. When I'm in touch with my needs, I'm much more likely to say the things that will actually get my needs met.
Yeah.
So instead of saying, I can't believe you're so selfish, you don't care about anyone but yourself, right? So instead of saying something like that, I could try saying, Natalie, I'm really hurting right now. I just really need some attention or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So by staying in touch with needs and recognizing that that's always what's going on as I'm trying to get my needs met, then I can more likely shift away from my violent patterns and to be able to shift into my heart, as we say in NVC, shift into my feelings and needs awareness and be able to communicate. Now, I'm also a very big fan of certain types of, therapies that can help us to do this. And I'm not saying that NVC is the only thing that can help us, but so a lot of people can benefit from other, systems and so forth.
Yeah.
So it helps me as a person who has a tendency to try to be violent and make people do things and call people names and all that kind of stuff. It also helps the other person who's on the receiving end of that. Because instead of taking on the belief of whatever the violent, that the person who's being violent in that moment, instead of taking on the belief of what they're saying, like, Natalie, you're just so selfish. You're this and you're that and blah, blah, blah. And you did, right? Instead of taking on those judgments, criticism, blaming, and all of that, it's more possible that you'll be able to see, wow, Steve is really hurting right now.
Yeah.
Steve is really needing something, maybe. And then you can actually ask me, right? So it will be less harmful and damaging for you because you can see that what I'm doing, and I'm using an NVC phrase now, I'm tragically trying to get my needs met. Natalie, you are so selfish. We call that a tragic expression of unmet needs. And that really helps. There's a concept in Buddhism that I love. It's called the second arrow. So the first arrow is what happens to us, the physical thing that happens to us.
Yeah.
So, you're upset with me and you tell me, Steve, you're such a bully, right? So that's the first arrow, right? The second arrow is what I make it mean inside of me. Oh my God, am I really a bully? Well, she's the bully. Right? And we go all the name calling, judging back and forth. Right? What NVC does is it helps us with the second arrow. Well, it helps us with both arrows, but it helps with the second arrow.
Yeah.
That if you're like, Steve, you can't believe you're such a bully. I hate you, whatever you're going to say. I can hear that as you're trying to get your needs met. I suffer way less. And again, it doesn't mean that I'm just going to sit here and take it.
Yeah.
No, because in NVC, we are very much about expressing to the other person how I would like them to relate to me. So it helps me to be able to hear that what you're really trying to do is to get your needs met. And I look deeper than the words that you're saying. Right? Marshall would say, don't listen to the words that when someone is speaking when they're being violent. Listen beneath those words to what's in their heart, to their feelings and the needs. So I suffer so much less when I can just hear the feelings and the needs that are going on for you. It also helps. So that's the second arrow. I'm going to have less suffering that I'm making go on inside of me by believing what you're saying or wondering if it's true or, oh yes, it's that confirms that I am a bully or all that stuff. We're going to have much less of that. But in addition to that, it helps with the first arrow, meaning I am going to be much more effective, or we even use the word powerful. I'm going to be much more powerful with you in helping both of us to get our needs met. Right? So if you say, Steve, you're such a bully, and I can empathize back with you of like, you're really upset right now. Like you really want more respect. And what I just said really didn't meet your need for respect. And you're like, yes, that's right. Right. And so if I empathize with you, then after you've gotten the empathy that you need, I could then say something like, Natalie, when you use words like bully and so forth to talk to me, it's really difficult for me to hear what's going on for you. Like, I really want to have a loving relationship with you, and it makes it so much more difficult when you call me names. Would you be willing, as best you can, to tell me what you're feeling and what you're needing instead of calling me names? Right? So then that's us working with the first arrow.
Yeah.
And you vice versa, doing that with me. When I slip into my, whatever violent stuff that I might do, I call you names, or I run out of the room, or whatever I'm doing. And you could say, Steve, when you walk out of the room when we're talking, I feel terrified. Like something really deep and scary goes on for me. And I really need connection at those moments. Is there some way that we could help you to stay in the room so that I can still just be with you? Maybe we stop talking for a while, just because I get so scared when that happens. So NVC is about both things. It's about helping each of us to learn to actually say what's going on, to be real about and authentic and honest about our feelings and our needs. And it helps us to listen when the other person doesn't know how to say their feelings and their needs. It helps us to be able to hear the feelings and the needs beneath those judgmental kinds of things that we say. So it works with both sides. And it's really important for me to add as well, NVC is also about changing the social structures of violence that support things like racism, sexism, oppression of the feminine in men and women, and all that kind of stuff. It's also about changing the systems that create us, as well as changing our individual behavior.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I felt a softening when you use the NVC language. So when you shared that request from that place of compassion, there was like a softening in my system. And I imagine that when there is name calling and blame and criticism, the person receiving that goes into defense mode. And so there's another arrow that can potentially be sent in the opposite direction. Yes. And having this as a tool means that we get to neutralize things. No more arrows being thrown, because there's an understanding of the need behind it.
Yes.
Yeah. I'd love for you to.
I just want to add one other thing.
Yeah.
There's a very common misunderstanding that NVC is about being polite, or about being nice, or it's about being relaxed, or whatever. That is not the case. That appears that way because it's, at least in our general subculture, it's taught by people like me who believe, at least one point in our life, believe that we should be nice. Right? But what NVC, Marsha would say, NVC is not about being nice. It's about being honest, and it's about being empathetic. Right? So he actually came up with a term to try to make this really clear.
Yeah.
And to say this term, I have to backtrack a little bit to say that in NVC, Marshall, well, here, let me get my. Marshall developed these puppets that he used. That this is a giraffe, and the giraffe represented compassionate consciousness, because the giraffe has the largest heart of any land animal. So he would use the giraffe to symbolize that part of us. that is capable of speaking from our heart. And then the ears represent the ability to hear what's going on for other people, even when they're not saying their feelings and their needs, to be able to hear the feelings and the needs beneath what they're saying. So the other end of that continuum is what he called the jackal. And the jackal simply represents the power over dominator kind of consciousness. And so when we say things like, you're so selfish, I can't believe blah, 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 things like that, judgment, criticism, blame, then he would call that speaking in jackal. So one of the quotes that he would use is, never listen to what a jackal speaking person has to say, especially if it's about you. Listen beneath the words to what's in the jackal's heart. Right. So if I say, Natalie, you're so selfish, and if you have your giraffe ears on, what you're going to hear is, Steve, are you really hurting right now? And you're really needing some care and understanding, right? That's what you're going to hear. You're going to hear these needs. So when we're speaking giraffe, there were two basic ways. One was what he called classic NVC, which means making an observation. Natalie, when you call me a bully, then I name a feeling. I feel really frustrated and sad.
Yeah.
And then I go to a need, because that really doesn't meet my need for respect and understanding and to be understood. That's the need. And then a request. Would you be willing to tell me what you're feeling and what you're needing instead of calling me a bully? Okay. That's what we call classic NVC, speaking classic NVC. There was also another term for how we maintain the consciousness of NVC, meaning wanting to share my heart with you, wanting to hear what's going on for you, having mutual care. But I'm going to use language that sounds much more natural and familiar. Right? And he called that street giraffe. And so street giraffe might be kind of a relaxed type of thing, like, hey, I'm really hurting right now. Like, I'm really wanting respect. I'm really wanting care. Right? That's a more kind of natural sounding, relaxed way of saying what my feelings are, what my needs are. But what if I'm feeling really intensely? Then in the NVC model, there is a place for expressing that intensity. And I'm not going to scream it really loud because we're being videotaped here, but I would say in a much louder voice, Natalie, gosh, I'm so frustrated right now. Like, I'm just really wanting to be heard. I'm just really wanting to be understood for what's going on for me. Right? So that's what he called screaming in giraffe. Right? So NVC is not about being nice. It's about being honest. And if what's being honest is the intensity of my feelings, then I might want to get that out. Now, that said, given that screaming in giraffe is part of the model, if I get big and loud and your background tells you that this is terrifying, some big guy here has a loud voice, if you go into some kind of trauma reaction from that, I'm not going to get my needs met. Right? So I wouldn't do that if I knew that you were going to have a reaction such that you wouldn't even be able to finish having a conversation with me. I wouldn't do it. So, but the main point that I'm just trying to make here is the concept of street giraffe speaking in ways that sound natural and screaming in giraffe speaking intensely if that's what's going on inside of me. NVC is not about being nice.
Yeah, good
It's
point.
about being honest. But what we mean by honest is different than normally what's meant by honest is I'm going to be honest and go share my judgments with somebody. Natalie, you are selfish and you're blah blah blah. That's not what we call honest in NVC. That's just
for
sharing
judgment. Right. Okay, so one of the other points that I want to touch on as we talk about how society teach men to operate versus women to operate, is in grieving, right? The ability or what feels like the room or the space for men to grieve, and how that's different from the room or the space that women have to grieve, just because of how we're socialized.
Yeah.
So some of what I hear is that, there is shutdown that might happen on the man's part, or they're not able to meet their partner emotionally or create space for their partner's emotional needs. And then there's some imbalance that then continues in the relationship as a result of that. So I'd love to hear any thoughts that are coming up for you. Yeah.
Sure. And again, I want to start with the foundational consciousness of NVC, which is that it's based on the belief that one of the most precious things that I can give you, that one human being can give another, is that which is in our heart. My feelings and my needs. The expression of that is one of the greatest gifts that I can give you. That is clearly not the basic message of our culture, but it is the basic message of NVC. And so most of us, going back to my story, most of us as men, boys and then men, grew up with the belief that the gift that I can give you is to be strong, is to not feel, is to be a rock, to be solid as a rock. And so it takes some very intentional work on the part of men to reclaim access to their emotions. And luckily today there's a growing men's movement. It's been growing for like 40 years now. There's been a growing men's movement to help men get together and in the safety of their own acceptance and appreciation of each other and their shared journey to help each other feel again. The Mankind Project is one of these places where that you can find this help. But I highly recommend it. It's rare for me to meet a man who is not to some degree, some significant degree, armored up and not able to feel his feelings.
Yeah.
So to be able to just acknowledge that this is my conditioning, it doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It doesn't even mean there's something wrong with me. It just means it's my conditioning and that it can be changed. One of the things that gets in the way of change, one of the main things that gets in the way of change is someone believing that there's something wrong with them. So men early on got set up to, play tough, shut down their feelings, all that kind of stuff. And if their partner or somebody tries to tell them there's something wrong with them, there's a part of them, there's a part of any human being that's going to resist that. But that's the thing that we do even when we genuinely care, where if we genuinely care about our partner, I want to tell him that, he's got emotional problems or whatever. And from an NVC perspective, we don't name those kinds of things as like mental disorders or whatever. We talk about them as patterns of behavior that have been developed in order to deal with the violence that we grew up with. And to invite and to invite men, to have empathy for that conditioning, and to invite men to reclaim what they've lost. So instead of saying, God, Steve, what's the matter with you? You're like a stone. You're like talking to a stone. What's the matter with you? To be able to empathize with why I am so armored up, and to share what you're feeling about the fact that you're not having the level of emotional connection that you would like with me.
Yeah.
Like, Steve, there's so much about our relationship that I really appreciate. And there's so much about you that I'm grateful for. And I keep running into this experience of kind of this emptiness that I have about wanting to have more emotional connection with you, and wanting to have this like a deeper, just sharing of what we're feeling. Like, that's what we call honesty. Right? And there's a saying in NVC that empathy heals and honesty brings growth. So conversely, the things that women are conditioned to not do, like speaking up, for instance. Like, if I am your partner and I'm aware that that's something that you're struggling with, then I could choose to empathize with you about, I'd love to hear, Natalie, what are some of the experiences that you had that led you to the tendency that you have to not share what's going on, and what are the ways that I show up in our relationship that might make that difficult for you to tell me what's going on. I can empathize with your challenge. I can want to understand and help you to grow through that. And I can share honestly with you, like, I really would like to hear when there's something really important going on for you. I'd like to hear it, at the time. I don't want you to just stuff it or have it to come out, 2 days later, with some kind of name calling fit or something. I would really like to be able to hear it at the time, but I would like to hear it in terms of feelings and needs. Because that will allow me to be able to really take it in. And so when we learn to relate in this compassionate way, we can help each other to heal from the damage that has been done, or the wounds, or the patterns that have been established in our violence, from the violence of our background. We can help each other to emerge out of that, to help each other to heal. To me, that is one of the most beautiful things. I've seen a lot of beautiful things, and as NVC has trickled into people's lives. But for me, that's one of the most beautiful. And my partner, Terry, and I have had some gorgeous experiences about helping each other to heal after we got into NVC, after we, scratched each other's face off for the first 7 or 8 years. And then we learned NVC and we helped each other to heal. So, so we can offer empathy to each other, because the belief in NVC is empathy is what heals. Empathy means connecting with the person's feelings and the needs. What it means, connecting to so I can connect with your feelings and needs about the ways that you've been conditioned that keep you from being your fullest self. I can be honest about how I feel about not experiencing you in that wholeness that I would like. And likewise with me, like you can empathize with me and my conditioning, and share how, you're feeling disappointed or sad or whatever about not having the experience of my fullness. So it's not being phrased as, Natalie, what's the matter with you? Steve, what's the matter with you? It's phrased, it's understood as something happened to you. And I'd like to help heal from that, so that we can have more richness and fullness and satisfaction between us. It's going toward what we want, rather than labeling each other and making demands and name calling and so forth about the things that we don't like.
Mm-hmm. Wow, thank you for that. That was all so rich. Mm-hmm. So I'll share what came up. There's a conversation that I had with a male friend, and he was sharing a lot about not enough resources being available for men to grieve and heal and to show up in their authentic self. And one of the points that he brought up was that in relationships or in connecting with women specifically, it didn't feel as though there was room for his vulnerability. So when he got a little bit vulnerable, he would meet upon, oh, okay, you're a guy, get yourself together, like toughen up. So there was like a little bit of an invitation to open up, and then the resistance, which I assume comes from how we're socialized, right? Like, oh, as the woman or as the person in this femme body, I get to be, softer, more delicate, more emotional, but as the partner, like you need to be strong enough to have my back. And so on the one hand, while there can be the desire for the male partner to soften, they might still be met with the resistance based on how their partner was socialized. And so I'm really appreciating the importance of having the space where, however people identify, they can be in that space and have that safety. And also the importance of working through challenges in relationship with a guide, so with a coach, with you, for example, with a counselor, the person who's the expert who can help to facilitate the conversation both ways.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And we're coming from so many different subcultures on this planet now. Like we're coming from so many different backgrounds that it is often challenging to understand more like the nuances of like, what does vulnerability mean to you and what does it mean to me? What does honesty mean to you? What does it mean to me? What does empathy mean to you? What does it mean to me? What does being strong mean to you? What does it mean? Like it's like exponentially important in our culture that we learn things like NVC, learn needs-based, empathy-based ways of communicating in order to deal with this diversity that's more and more in our lives. Up until maybe probably just like the last 100 years, I mean, human beings have only lived with people like themselves for the most part, Hungarian village in Europe, my dad's family, and my mom was French Canadian. So people lived with people of their own religion, their own language, their own class for the most part. And all of that is changing. So it's requiring a lot of emotional intelligence that most of us don't have, that we're learning under, the intensity of the pressure cooker that we're in. We're being motivated to learn these kinds of things in order to deal with the diversity. I mean, even at Earth Haven, almost have all been white forever. All the 27 years. But there's a lot of diversity from the subcultures that we come from. A Southern subculture, a Northeastern subculture, a farm subculture in my place, a Catholic subculture, a Jewish, and so the pressure is really on for us to be able to develop this emotional intelligence. And for me, the core of that emotional intelligence is what we say in NVC, is to recognize that everything someone does is an attempt to meet a need. And if I don't understand why someone's doing something, to try to figure out what need they're trying to get met by doing that thing. And to develop some basic common literacy about how to talk about feelings, how to talk about needs,
Mm-hmm.
to not try to force people to do things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there are these basic ways of being
Mm-hmm.
that are required more and more of us, and it gets
Mm-hmm.
played out in exactly the situation that you were talking about,
Mm-hmm.
where I have a certain idea of how I want the woman that I'm in relationship to be, and like a
Mm-hmm.
woman needs to be strong but soft. What does that mean? That could mean a whole range of things.
Yeah.
One of the most basic parts of NVC is what we call making clear, positive, specific requests.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of me saying to you, I really would like you to be more soft in our relationship, or I would really like you to be stronger in our relationship.
Yeah.
That's a tragic way of speaking.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some of those specifics? But see, we're not taught to think in terms of specifics.
Yeah.
We're taught to think in terms of judgments. You're being a
Mm-hmm.
little too whatever,
Yeah.
and you should be more blank,
Yeah.
rather than, when you speak, like, when you call me names or whatever, I feel this or that,
Mm-hmm.
would you be willing to tell me what you're feeling right now? Or
Mm-hmm.
some kind of thing like that. We learn to make very specific requests.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a lot of cultural merging that's going on right now, and it's a beautiful thing. I mean, we're becoming a planetary civilization. It's clearly moving in that direction. But those of us who have put ourselves into situations where there's a lot of diversity, or any degree of diversity, that is being involved in sharing power with people and being in proximity with people, really requires a different kind of intelligence that NVC has a lot to offer to that.
Yeah, a shared language among all, the differences of backgrounds.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've referenced needs a lot because that is, a part of the foundation of NVC. And I remember the resources that you shared as we were going through this course, the needs, the list of needs and the list of feelings. And as I read the list of needs, it felt compassionate. That's the word that's coming up. Just like, almost like, here are a list of things that can support humans in thriving, because it went beyond, food, shelter, like those basic needs, to like really core needs that we often aren't even aware of. So I'd love for you to share like a sample of what some of those are.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Marshall turned me on to a guy named Manfred Max Neef, who is a Chilean economist. And in their school of economics that they've been developing for decades now, it's based on evaluating an economic system based on to what degree it meets people's needs, rather than some just a gross national product thing or whatever.
Right.
So in that system, then they had to ask themselves, what are the human needs? If we want to measure this, we have to know what we want to measure. So they came up with basically 9 categories. And they can be stated as sustenance, safety, love, empathy, rest, recreation, and play, community, creativity, autonomy, and meaning and purpose in life. So those 9 basic needs can then be broken down. It can be like, specific, like the handout that I give out has about 125 words on it. But those are the 9 basic categories. And that's what we mean by a need. A need is universal. All human beings, regardless of age, race, religion, economic class, whatever, all human beings have the same needs.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is a different way of using the word needs than we usually do, because we say things like, well, Natalie, I really need you to talk to me differently. Well, that's not a need. That's what we would call a strategy to get a need met. So recognizing that we all have the same needs,
Mhm.
and the way that we say that again is that we say it's universal. Needs are universal,
Mhm.
and they in total are what is required for a human being to thrive.
Mm.
So there's lots of people on the planet today who have chronic unmet needs.
Mhm.
People in prison, people in violent households, people in poverty, so forth. Lots of different situations where people are not having all their needs met, or even a
Mhm.
lot of their needs met. And
Mhm.
so they're alive, but they're not thriving. So
Right.
the goal of NVC is for everyone to thrive.
Mhm.
And in order to do that, moment by moment, we have to know what our needs are. So in NVC, we
Mhm.
put a lot of time and energy into developing a literacy about needs. And
Yeah.
just starting with those 9 can
Mhm.
be a great start. Uh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So I would love for people to have some resources and, the ability to go deeper in learning this, in learning from you, or in learning in general. So please share where people can learn from you and how you work with people. I know you have a combination of private sessions and group sessions or group courses, and there's also Compassion Camp that is a couple of weeks away from this recording. So I would love for you to share more about those.
Yeah. Thank you. So first I want to mention the primary book that Marshall wrote about NVC is called Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life.
Mm.
And Marshall Rosenberg is the author,
Mhm.
and it's published by Puddle Dancer Press. So that would be the first book that I would recommend.
Mhm.
That publisher, Puddle Dancer, one word, Puddle Dancer Press, publishes basically just nonviolent communication books. So if you want to know more about NVC resources, that's a great place to go, Puddle Dancer Press. There's lots of stuff on YouTube, videos that you can watch and so forth.
Mhm.
There's also an international organization called the Center for Nonviolent Communication. So the website is CNVC, cnvc.org. And
Mhm.
there you can, through that website, you can find NVC trainers and so forth in your own area. You can search by zip code and so forth, and by country as well, to find people in your area. If you're interested in working with me, my website is called therealcenter.org, therealcenter.org. I run classes both in person and online. Every 2 months, I run a cycle of classes. I have a 4-level curriculum and a year-long immersion program. I also do coaching. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a psychologist. I just call myself a life and relationship coach. I do that both in person for couples and individuals and sometimes families,
Mhm.
as well as for organizations. I do it online or in person.
Mhm.
And as you mentioned, we also have this annual event called Compassion Camp. And this is our 4th year that we're doing it. And it happens at Earth Haven Eco Village here in the Western North Carolina, greater Asheville area. And it was designed for people to meet each other, to build community, to share skills, and to celebrate together. We usually have about 100 people, and
Mhm.
people report that it's very often a life transforming experience.
Mhm.
We also have started monthly, what we call compassion day camps.
Mhm.
And so in this coming year, from September on, the 3rd Saturday of every month, we will be gathering for a day-long event, and that will be held at various places. It's not held at Earth Haven.
Mhm.
It's held at a couple different places in the Asheville area.
Mhm.
And that information will be on my website as well.
Mhm.
Um, the Compassion Camp information, well, there's a link on my website, but it's the registration and is done through the School of Integrated Living, schoolofintegratedliving.org. And you can read more about it there and register there.
Yeah.
See if there's anything else I'm missing. Oh, there is a Asheville area NVC website, nvcasheville.org. I think it's org. That there are various people in who are promoting NVC, like myself, who have information on there about events that they're doing. I also have a monthly practice group. If you're living in this area, in the Asheville area, in fact, tonight is our monthly practice group. But anyhow, the first Friday of every month, and that is also on my website. It's an in-person practice group for people who are wanting to connect with other people interested in NVC and learn together. So those are the resources that I can think of.
Beautiful. Thank you. And as we prepare to close, I know that we could talk for hours about this, but as we prepare to close for now, any final words that you'd like to leave with listeners? Final words, final thoughts?
Yes, thank you for asking. I constantly try to remind myself that there is a bigger force at work in the world. You can call it God, you can call it the universe, whatever, that I believe is moving us in this direction of being more compassionate, more caring, and that this energy is inside of us, wanting at all times for us to tend it, to access it, to help us to heal from the things that we've been exposed to and be able to grow in our capacity to love ourselves, love other people, to serve the world, and that is really at the heart of why each one of us is here, is to find our own way to transforming the violence that we have experienced, turning it into more intention and skill for being able to relate compassionately with ourselves and other people, and collectively to help bring more peace, justice, love, and compassion to the world.
Thank you. Thank you. Such a beautiful and elevating conversation. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you for the beautiful work that you're doing in the world. And it's an honor and joy to be with you and to offer this to your community.
Thank you. Receiving that. All right, all. So you have just heard another episode of the podcast, and this felt so beautiful and so nourishing. You can find Steve at therealcenter.org, and your email, Steve, what is it?
Steve at therealcenter.org.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right. Thank you all, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye.
Thank you.